Alrighty, good to go. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Lachlan Blackhall, and I head up the battery storage and grid integration program here at the ANU. And obviously, our program is one of the programs that sits within the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. So a real pleasure to have you in the room and online for the session today, which is going to be focusing on the challenges and opportunities for local energy. So before we get in to the session proper, please allow me to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the land on which we meet, which for those of us here in the ACTs are Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. So as I said, a real pleasure to be here today and to have our esteemed panel on the stage and also online. So hopefully we do have our panel online. So by way of brief introductions, with you today, we have Claire Maries joining us online, who's the Manager of DER Markets and Networks at the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. We've got Andrew Fraser joining us from the Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program, and obviously a colleague of mine. So Andrew heads up a lot of our work around electricity distribution networks and supporting transition, and also joined by our colleague, Dr. Hedda Ransan-Cooper, who's also within Battery Storage and Grid Integration Program and heads up a lot of our social science work. So before we sort of get into the framing and the discussion, I just wanted to sort of give you a brief overview of how the session is going to be structured. So I'm going to make a few very minor opening remarks just to frame the session. Then we're going to showcase the panelists that we have with us, who are each going to give short burst presentations covering off on various areas related to local energy. We'll then start to have a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves up here, and then we'll obviously throw over to the audience for Q&A. So on the screen, if we might be able to show both the speaker and the slide, you'll see the details around how you can submit questions via Vevox. So we'll get that up. There we go. So for those of you both in the room and online, certainly feel free to use submissions via Vevox. It does make it nice and easy for us to see the questions coming in. Within the room here, though, we'll also have roving microphones as well, and so happy to take your questions from here once we get into the Q&A session. So with that all said, let's dive in, and to frame the discussion that we're about to have, I'd like to maybe just think a little bit about what our future energy system is going to look like. And so, we talk a lot about the energy transition and sort of what that, the necessity of the energy transition, obviously, to achieve net zero. But so when you look at the forecasts for what our future energy system is going to look like, it becomes pretty clear that we're going to have two sets or two types of assets in our electricity system. So about 50% of our energy generation and storage capacity is going to be in the form of utility scale wind and solar generation, and then utility scale storage, both in the form of pumped hydro and utility scale battery storage. But the other 50% are going to be all of these distributed and decentralized assets. And so things like solar PV on our roofs, residential and neighbourhood battery systems, electric vehicles as we transition the transport sector to net zero. And all of these distributed assets are going to be connected to the distribution network. And so to give you the scale of sort of the challenge and the opportunity, we talk a lot about transmission, and we have about 40,000 kilometres of transmission network in Australia, or as part of the NEM. We have about 1 million kilometres of distribution network in the NEM. And then when we start to think about the scale of the distributed energy resources or consumer energy resources that are being connected to that, over 3 million homes already have solar connected to it, and we're the highest per capita adopter of residential solar PV of anywhere in the world. And so when we're talking about local energy, which is what we're going to be talking about today, we're really focused on all of these distributed consumer resources connected into the distribution network. And so that is also going to be a really critical part of the energy transition, and why it's great to be able to spend a session like today focusing on that. So with that, I'm going to now hand over to our panelists to each give their perspective on that. And thank you. And we're going to start with Andrew, who's going to provide some context around some of the challenges that we're facing in the transition to local energy.
Thanks, Lachlan.
Could we just grab the slide as well as the, thank you. Sorry, I'm technologically challenged, which is quite embarrassing, given what we do for jobs.
That's
I've
right.
got 4 buttons here and I've now tried all 4, so I'm not having a lot of luck. Thank you very
There
much,
we go.
Andrew.
So I think this slide's a little bit fitting after that, Lachlan. Thank you. This is what comes into my head when I start to think about the power system that we've got. And it might seem a little bit weird, but bear with me for a minute. This is definitely an imperfect analogy, but I think there's some parallels to the transition that we're starting to face with the energy system that we've got. So, so this is an image of a performer performing the spinning plates routine. So plates spinning around up in the air, and to me, this is somewhat representative of the generators that we've got in the power system. They spin and they're actually a little bit unstable. We've, over the years, we've built some pretty advanced control systems to ensure that they actually keep spinning and spin quite nicely. So the if we look at the NEM, the NEM up until sort of 15 years ago has had a small number of these large spinning plates, if you like, and they've been happily spinning away with some very sophisticated control systems, to make sure they actually sit very nicely at 50 hertz. But we've also built markets around them as well, so we can ensure that there's enough generation at the right times. We're getting the lowest cost energy out at those certain times. And that may not be perfect, but it's actually something that's worked pretty well for that particular system. And importantly as well, I think if we follow me down this rabbit hole of my imperfect analogy, the network itself can be the table that all these plates are sitting on and spinning from. We know a lot about the transmission network and can actually tweak the plates to keep them spinning pretty nicely. So as Lachlan said, we're now moving to a time where we've got not just 100 of these, order of 100 or so of these large generators, but we've got millions now. Distributed energy assets that are of different shapes and sizes have been put there for many different reasons. But they're all actually coupled through the same physics. They're actually all part of one system. And so if you envisage now this picture, but with half the big plates, and we replace those with at least 3 million tiny little plates on little sticks. And now all of a sudden the tuxedo performer here has got an entirely different job to do. The scale of these devices is an entirely different system that we need to be able to work with. And so we start to think then about how do we actually, what systems do we need to engage with these different assets and their owners and their ownership structures and what they value and what they want to do. And the problems become quite challenging. So if we just take the systems that we use for those big spinning plates and try and retrofit them to the little ones, it's really hard. We simply can't afford the engineering to engineer bespoke control systems for each one. The scale's just not there. We can't even take the market construct that we've got at the moment because we don't necessarily know enough about the low voltage network to be able to model and optimize and dispatch the systems in the same way. Many of these systems don't even want to participate in a network, in a market, sorry. So there's lots of different challenges, and they come at lots of different factors that are not just technical. But I think if I can leave you with the imagery of not just a handful of spinning plates, but millions of spinning plates, and think about the systems and the processes that are appropriate for that, they're the sort of challenges that we need to start to deal with.
Great. Thanks very much, Andrew. We're now going to turn our attention away from the challenges and to the opportunities. And so to do that, I'll invite Hedda to make a few remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Lachlan, and thanks everyone for coming along to this session. So I might actually start a little bit with some of the challenges, because I think that does provide an important sort of context for why I see the opportunities in the way that I do. So also to give you a bit of context for the work that we do sort of social research, which is primarily qualitative. So we go out to a wide range of different householders from as diverse background as we can. And we do interviews, like quite long interviews with them, and focus groups where we get them together as well to kind of talk about these issues. And we're really focused when we're speaking to them about these cutting edge technologies that our colleagues in engineering and other disciplines are exploring. So things like virtual power plants, things like neighbourhood scale batteries, or community batteries as they're often termed as well. And so we've been doing this now for the last few years, and really the kind of problem and the context that's driving these conversations is the fact that we do have this really high, increasingly complex system and high penetration solar, and it's kind of creating these sorts of issues, technical issues on the grid that we need to find, good solutions to enable more solar and to enable the system to kind of run smoothly. And the thing that sort of jumps out really immediately when we're speaking with people is this problem around the distrust in the current system. And that's been an issue that probably you've heard about before, and it's been sort of it's getting to the point where sort of people inside the industry and people inside consumer advocacy have been talking about this issue of distrust for the last several years, and noticing that it's a problem and thinking about it as a source of concern. But really, it comes at a head when we start talking about some of these solutions at the local level, because when we start to talk about these sorts of solutions, the questions that we get are around things like, who is going to be owning this? Where do the benefits flow? Can we trust these actors, these market actors that are proposing these sorts of solutions? Entities like aggregators. And really, a lot of the kinds of ways that these solutions are framed, things like virtual power plants, where you're provided a financial incentive to giving your energy back to the grid, they've really met with like quite active disinterest and disengagement from people. And really what comes through when we start to speak to people about, well, what are the values that you're interested in? What are the ways that you do want to engage? It's really, the civic values come up really strongly. So wanting to frame these sorts of issues as a collective problem rather than an individual responsibility. And I think this is where the sort of more positive aspect comes in which people are really engaged in energy issues. The kind of problem of climate change is really present for a lot of people, as as attested to by the interest in events like this, and the rise of community energy groups, the online forums in which you're seeing everyday people coming together to kind of try and do their bit, I suppose, for the energy transition. So the sorts of values that we're seeing is wanting more kind of control and autonomy at this local level. Decarbonisation comes through really strongly as well, but really an interest in supporting other people that are excluded as well from the energy transition. So a lot of values that I think the kind of current system is not particularly well equipped to kind of answer and resolve. So I find myself often in a quite challenging situation where the sorts of values and sorts of problems and the issues that householders are sharing with me really challenge a lot of the orthodoxy around the way that energy policy is thought of and conceived of, in which, you know, the role of the government is to kind of provide some support to market development, and then we sort of let the market go and deliver the energy innovation. And in the context of such low levels of trust and faith in the market to deliver that, yeah, I find myself in quite a tricky situation there, and I don't have all the answers, but I think it's something that we need to grapple with, and again see the kind of interest and engagement as an opportunity rather than a problem and a challenge. I might leave that there.
Great, thank you very much for that. And I think that the point maybe just to draw out from what Hedda's saying, which I think is one that's really interesting, is particularly in the Australian context, we've gone from a decade really where there's been a real technology-centric approach to thinking about how the energy transition might occur. And what's underway at the moment, I think, is a broader recognition of the fact that these are socio-techno-economic challenges, and that we really do have to focus on the people and the householders and the communities who are going to be impacted by this. And this was a theme that was obviously brought up in the last session as well. So in the context of enabling local energy, I'm now going to invite Claire to provide her perspectives on what needs to be done from a government and policy perspective. Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Lachlan. Just checking you guys can hear me. Excellent. I got a new laptop today of all days. It's been not behaving very well, and I am not very technical either. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about enabling local energy and how we can take these challenges and opportunities and implement projects on ground. So since 2021, the Victorian government has been running the Neighbourhood Battery Initiative to trial a number of business models from feasibility to implementation to get a better sense of really what these challenges to deployment are, so that we can realise this huge sentiment that Hedda was just talking about and turn it into actual on-ground projects that both provide a network service, but also allow this level of community engagement and you know, an opportunity to build community trust. So the program's now supported 13 feasibility studies and 5 on-ground projects through 2 rounds of funding, but I need to stress here that there is only one that has been installed and is operational at this point, which is the Yarra Energy Foundation Neighbourhood Battery in North Fitzroy, so fairly urban Melbourne. As the projects have progressed, we've been collecting the findings and the lessons to assess how to better enable local energy through, again, this is just about neighbourhood scale batteries, but really there have been so many findings, so many issues that have arisen that you would expect from a first of its kind program like this. They've really spanned the technical, regulatory, financial, and kind of the informational. Some of them have affected all projects, whereas some have affected only a few. And, you know, in the spirit of providing a quick burst, I won't go into all of them. But I will share with you the few things that we see as the critical policy issues to enable the scale up and rollout of neighbourhood batteries at the scale that's now been committed to by both the federal government and our own new state government. So the few core issues that we think are pretty universal across all of our projects are access to low voltage network information. So almost all of the projects face delays in delivery, either of their kind of on ground or their feasibility, because they are unable to access granular enough data on the low voltage network to know where a battery would work, either to provide network services or just to not upset the apple cart. So some DNSPs have seen this as an opportunity to relieve network constraints, and other DNSPs have seen it as a threat to existing network constraints because of the lack of visibility of a asset that they don't own. Another big one has been provision of fair network tariffs. So at the outset of the program, none of the Victorian DNSPs had even thought about how to charge for a neighbourhood battery. Through close collaboration with our DNSPs, we can now report that CitiPower Powercore UE does have a trial tariff out till 2026, which is when our next reg reset happens. And we understand that the other Victorian DNSPs are moving in that direction. Another big one has been the value stack and how do you scale up to access it. So in our experience, proponents who have spanned DNSPs, retailers and aggregators, community groups, small startups, etc. They often talk about the value stack as making the battery feasible, but at the end of the day, many services provided by DER are not monetised, and many proponents make pretty heavy assumptions about tapping into FCAS markets. The reality is, though, that these projects are pretty small and they don't meet the threshold for FCAS, which begs the question of how can you aggregate them and how can you build the trust to trust an aggregator, but also how can you get enough of them on the ground to make it worthwhile to aggregate them so they hit that 1 megawatt threshold, which is always, yeah, it's a really interesting sort of consideration. Noting that we're committing to lots of these. We've got one that's operational in Victoria, and it's, you know, the finding has been that it is hard to make them stack up in a financial sense. And then picking an operational model has been another really interesting one, which is essentially what our initiative set out to test. Communities are really excited about the possibilities, from solar soaking to increased reliability or simply just making money through arbitrage. But at the end of the day, a battery is unlikely to be able to optimise for everything. So communities really do need to make choices, and that's where some of the work we've been doing with ANU around the guidelines that are in development have been sort of focusing around how do we educate proponents to help them kind of realise that these trade-offs exist. So in our experience, addressing these challenges is going to be critical to enabling on-ground projects. Our experience across other programs, including our voltage management and electric vehicle work, highlights that getting these settings right for neighbourhood battery projects will also benefit other local energy innovations, including the provision of public EV charging or aggregation programs such as VPPs that can also provide local energy solutions but network services at the same time. The final thing I would say is important to call out here goes back to what Hedda was saying. If we're looking slightly beyond neighbourhood batteries, is the fundamental importance of community trust. If we want people to help provide local energy services and support grid integration of really high DER scenarios through subscribing to VPPs or vehicle to grid programs, we need them to trust that we have their best interests at heart. So we see neighbourhood batteries as a key to building this trust. So you know, making sure that we've got those energy assets in the community, providing services for the community that give them a level of control. I'll leave it there. Happy to take questions.
Great. No, I think that's set the scene well. I think maybe just to pick up on one of the comments that Claire just made around sort of the state of you know, low voltage data and things like that. Andrew, I might get you just to talk a little bit about, like, can you sketch us a picture of what it's like to actually connect an asset to a distribution network? Because I suspect the reality of what we see on a day-to-day basis might be slightly different from what people imagine it is.
Yeah, that's right. The low voltage network for many distribution networks has really been sort of this long forgotten asset that was, you know, once put in many, many years ago. And it was always put in, you know, they were you know, sized well enough to handle, you know, a load that was foreseen sort of 20 years ago. But obviously now we're trying to do a lot more with that. We're trying to, you know, put electric vehicle chargers on it. We're trying to add solar and batteries, which actually means some of those assets are not quite big enough. But I think the thing to understand with distribution networks, and as Lachlan said, how many million kilometres of...
About a million.
A million kilometres of different assets out there. It's really just a huge volume of assets to handle. And a lot of these, as I said, a lot of these assets went in quite a while ago. And when a lot of those older ones went in, the record keeping was not great, to say the least. But at the time it suited its purpose. The phasing, for example, so which wire customers are connected to. If there's 3 that run down the street, which wire customers connected to, it was never recorded. That was actually quite a useful thing if we wanted to do any sort of modelling to understand that phasing, that phase balance. A lot of the other assets were put in and just sort of recorded as copper. but not which size it was. And again, 50 years ago, it didn't matter. The stuff that's put in now is actually, is really well documented, and there's lots of, there's modern GIS systems that capture a lot of that stuff, which is great, but they're not necessarily the areas where there are issues. It's the
just to clarify, when you're saying low voltage, what's the voltage you're talking about?
So 240 volts basically. So the stuff that sort of runs down the street, comes across the road into your house, either on the barge board or underground service. So it'll be 240 single phase, or 415 or 400 volt 3-phase. So it's the last mile, if you like.
And I think the reason for sketching this catastrophe is to really put in, to really give you a sense of what it means to go and connect. We're talking, say, neighbourhood batteries. There's potentially 500 neighbourhood batteries that have been announced nationally. So think about this from 500 neighbourhood batteries, and then think about the next 10 million assets that we're going to see beyond that: solar, resi batteries, and EVs. And it's sort of the scale of the challenge is actually very significant.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought we might sort of turn our attention to the fact that when we talk about the transition, we tend to, particularly in the local energy context, just assume that it really is just a fait accompli. That householders and communities, they want all of these assets. They're going to love them. They're going to have their apps, and they're going to be monitoring their energy data. And I thought I might just simply ask the question, is that true? And if it's not true, why not? So Hedda, do you want to get us started?
Yes, it's a great question. I think there's a lot of what we call heroic assumptions that go into a lot of the kind of local smart digital energy technology space. Strange with energy, we don't see the same sort of attention to looking at what people want out of the technology, how might they use it, as compared to some other industries like, thinking about ICT and the car industry. They often employ anthropologists and design sociologists who really carefully kind of go through product development to understand, how are people what do people want out of this technology? How are they going to use it in their day-to-day lives? What are the design features that we need to build in to make sure that it fits into their routines? I recently heard an anthropologist who works for Volvo, go through a really in-depth study with householders about charging. And it was a really, really in-depth study that really talked really carefully and slowly through the process with people. We don't see those same sorts of disciplinary perspectives and practitioner perspectives in the sort of smart energy space, if you like. And so the work that has been done, the sort of social science analysis that has been done by colleagues in Monash and in other places around Australia and overseas have really found that the design of some of these smart energy systems just don't actually fit with people's routines. They end up sort of not downloading the app. It doesn't work in the way that they want them to work. They don't engage in the way that the designers assume they will engage. So I think there is a lot of work for us to do as a kind of collective in sort of starting with, well, how do people actually want to engage with energy? And that's the starting that's the starting question, really, rather than assuming a whole bunch of things about the way that people want to engage. So.
Claire, can I throw to you for sort of an answer to the same question from a sort of a government perspective, how you think about, how to support these technologies, sort of if people want them or not?
Yeah, look, I think the evidence and the data sort of shows you that people definitely want distributed energy resources. You know, we've had huge uptake of solar in Victoria through the Solar Victoria program. You know, wait lists for electric vehicles are incredibly long. Batteries maybe less so because they haven't come down the price kind of curve as quickly as other technologies may have. But then the data that we're seeing through Solar Victoria's programs around rebates for a battery versus rebates for a battery with a VPP, that's part of a VPP, you get more money in the rebate if you subscribe to the VPP. The uptake of it, you know, we're struggling to get people to subscribe to those sorts of programs. And I think that really points to people are really keen for the technology, but not necessarily, we have to kind of get a clearer understanding or be more clear with ourselves about what they want from it. So, you know, speaking of heroic assumptions, if you look at the ISP for this year with the level of storage that's forecast to be aggregated, that it's not really matching, or behind the meter aggregation, it's really not matching up to what we're seeing on the ground. And, you know, we're not necessarily thinking about how we make sure that we bring community on this journey and how we tap into what it is that motivates them and what they want from this technology, rather than sort of thinking about what we need it to do and what we need from it in terms of technical integration and providing the network services and making sure that all of those tiny plates on tiny sticks that the poor guy in the tuxedo has to spin can actually stay spinning, rather than, you know, cause, I don't know, more problems at peak when everything's charging at the wrong time, or an inability to address minimum demand because you know, all of the energy nerds sitting in the office buildings thought that everybody would really get into flexible exports and interoperability, but in reality, people aren't there. So it's really about that tension between what people want and what we need, and finding that sort of middle ground about how we tap into what they want to find solutions to some of the challenges that are arising.
And I think that's a really, you know, good point to ask the next question, which is, how do you actually go out and find out what people want? I mean, I think for a lot of the energy industry, we do like to sort of, you know, to sit in rooms together and talk about all the things we could do. But when you are talking about actually working with householders and communities, what is the right way to actually go and engage with them? So, Claire, do you want to take the government perspective on that?
Oh, I was about to say, you talk to Hedda and you find some budget, or you talk to Hedda's counterparts at Monash. No, look, I think that there is a real challenge for us at this point in making more consumer-centric policy and understanding that, you know, we've got a lot of the regulatory settings in place for a market that has worked well to date, but is it time to sort of flip it on its head a little bit and think about what ways can we incentivize or enable better use of the technology in ways that make, you know, that have clearer signals for consumers, or clearer signals for, say, batteries and neighbourhood batteries that are, you know, almost the perfect technology in terms of being able to automate and being able to respond to much more pure signals. You know, the network battery storage tariffs are, you know, something that we need to do some more thinking about, and whether we treat storage as just load anymore, or do we need to sort of rethink how we classify these technologies so that we can help people to get better value out of them. But look, it's a big area that we're kind of at the start of that journey, I think. But, you know, steering away from just the pure economics to more of the kind of behavioural and how we find the middle ground in there, I think is really important.
Right. I mean,
Yes,
apparently
I
we
would
talked to
agree
Hedda. So
I agree with everything that Claire just said. I think that you put it really beautifully, actually. And I think, look, I think the lack of engagement with people is sort of a legacy of the system that Andrew just described, because I guess in the previous system, a lot of the kind of complexity and the values, they were geared towards, you know, the major players, the incumbents, the people that were sort of running the system. And now what's shifted is that, you know, it's householders who are the owners of, well, not all of the generation, obviously. There's still a lot that's going to be at the large scale. But what I really sort of see time and time again in speaking with, you know, really thoughtful and considered energy professionals that are trying to solve these problems is that they're still not quite seeing householders and the public as a really active stakeholder in the conversation. So yes, we have kind of consumer advocacy organisations in the energy governance space, but they're often not super well resourced and often really busy just dealing with the kind of acute regulatory kind of questions that are pressing, and don't necessarily have the resources and the time to kind of go out and do that, have that conversation with householders. And I still remember a study, again done by some colleagues at Monash a few years ago, that went to talk to everybody in the energy sector about the importance of engaging people in the kind of in the future grid and what could that look like and so on. And everybody agreed that it was really important and that we should do it, and we should have some central body that's sort of having this dialogue with the community and bring them along on the energy transition. But, you know, nobody put their hand up to take on that role. And so that's something that is just really missing from the current governance arrangement, is that there is no one sort of entity, I suppose, that is responsible for having that dialogue with the public and bring them along on this journey, and it being a truly deliberative, like they're an actual stakeholder that actually have values and interests and ideas about the energy transition, and we should be listening to that.
yeah, I think it's a really good point. And actually, I'm going to start. I'm trying to multitask with two screens here, which is either going to go really, really well or really, really poorly. Start taking some questions that have come in, and at the same time, I'll ask for the mic to start going out so we can get some hands up in the audience. I think the question that's coming online is really around, so someone who participated in a virtual power plant test, they got no feedback on completion. There was supposed to be a commercial organisation who was then actually, you know, supposed to be doing research. And the question which is posed is, you know, do we need a government regulator or somebody to actually, you know, to take responsibility for this? And I think this goes to what you were saying, Hedda. We've got three market bodies plus Energy Consumers Australia. We've got the federal government, we've got all of the state governments and so on. We've also got the ESB.
Ombudsman.
Yeah.
Ombudsfolk.
You know, to the panel, who should be taking charge of coordinating all of this?
It is a question we've been considering in the VicGov, and in fact recently closed a consultation paper that was entitled something about protections for consumers of DER or something like that, because we're really aware of the gap, both in terms of just the fundamental consumer protections if you're getting an essential service but from a non licensed entity, so not required to meet all of those fundamental consumer protections, but also then more broadly around how do you protect the broader interests of consumers when we do start talking about things like flexible demand programs or you know, the vast array of things that could happen with zero emissions vehicles, and you know, the energy picture suddenly applying both to your stationary and your transport energy. So it's not something that I would say that we have answers to yet, but it is something that we are actively considering, for that very reason, that, you know, the the need of consumers in this market is different. And often as energy professionals, we talk about it comes down to the consumer narrative. And there's no one entity responsible for that consumer narrative. But to get back to the question about the VPPs as well, you know, there's no minimum standard or minimum, you know, how we talk to people or what commitments are being made. So yeah, it's under active consideration, but unfortunately I don't have any clear answers right now.
I thought we were going to get a clear statement. Victoria was going to take charge of the entire system.
He's out of caretaker and don't formally have a minister right now, so you might have to accept that I'm the bureaucrat.
I mean, we often hear answers to this question being something that we actually need to go back and renegotiate the Constitution. So I think it's a difficult problem for us all to solve. There's a question in the audience.
Yes, I wonder whether we shouldn't join this argument or this discussion up with the $8 billion quoted for additional poles and wires. I'd like the panel's comments as to if we get this end of everything right at the local level, does that mean 8 billion is guaranteed, or does it mean it'll be less? And if we get it wrong, will it mean it's going to be substantially more than 8 billion? And the other half of the question that I think there is, are we trying to go a step too far at this level at the moment? And should we all be looking as an interim solution, what I would call the South Australian solution of major batteries in the system as we adjust the local delivery end of it at the low voltage 240, 415 volt area?
Right. So I think sort of two questions for the panel. First is, you know, if we get, you know, how does getting local right, I suppose, then contribute to the role of transmission, which I think was the question. And then the second question being, I suppose, the relationship between local and more local storage and utility scale storage. So Andrew, I might start with you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think when I start to think about the transition that we're now faced with and the timeframes that we're looking at really now in the next sort of 13 years, with the recent announcements for the retirement of coal looking, you know, pretty much at 2035, we've got very little time left to actually start to replace all that generation and build the rest of the generation that we need to power all the electric vehicles and all the other electrification of the other fuel types as we start to decarbonise things. So I think the answer is actually we need to be running pretty hard at all of these things. Even if we do overshoot them, I think we need to be running hard at local energy, trying to get as much in there as we can, as well as the large-scale transmission connected renewables as well. So I think there's an awful lot that we've got to do. We simply don't have the time now to sit back and actually work through $8 billion worth of transmission build, getting that through communities. That there's certainly going to be a hard road ahead for getting all that through and built and connected. If that starts to get pushed out in time, we really struggle to get everything done. So I think it's unfortunately the time is a bit short to be sort of picking one or the other. I feel like it's both and more.
I guess while I agree with you, it should be both. Governments could move in at the 500 megawatt or whatever it is, South Australian solution almost now.
Yeah.
The home end of it and all these rooftop solar panels is not going to happen now. And so it can be a bit of both, recognising that we're going to need both.
Yeah, well, and to that, I think there's definitely it'd be good to hear more about this too, but there's definitely a push into that larger scale battery storage scope. There's sort of government work that is pushing ahead with that. I mean, Hedda and I were talking a little bit before this as well, that there's been low uptake with VPPs. There is less sort of push incentive wise in that space as well. So it feels like there's certainly a lot more interest and momentum building towards the larger transmission connected batteries more so than the VPP side of things.
So the other sting in the tail that I think needs to be looked at is, do we start looking at where these resources should be located? Wind blows over most of the country, the sun's over all the country.
And I think
we're now looking at wind offshore. And I see New South Wales has got renewable energy zones already. So if we try and tailor the location of the renewables being generated, where the future demand's likely to be, will that help? And will we still need the 8 billion?
Yeah, I think the sort of, there's no simple answer to that, but to be fair, the ISP, an integrated system plan, actually provides a really good case study of this kind of integrated planning where we are actually now mapping where renewables are going to be generated, where storage is likely to be located, what other enabling technologies we might need, like synchronous condensers, and then thinking about all of the transmission that's going to be needed. So I might throw to another question in the room.
Check 1, 2. You pick up on your point about the neighbourhood batteries, 500 batteries around the nation. Can you give me an idea of the sort of scale of this? When you say neighbourhood, are we talking about a street, both sides of the street, talking about half a suburb, is that a neighbourhood? That's the first part. Second part is, I'm not an electrician, so I'm wondering, from a technical point of view, who has the expertise to actually install, design the hardware, design the software? Is that an electrical engineer, or is it a trade electrician? Who has the know-how to do that?
Yeah, great questions. In terms of what it looks like, I might throw to Hedda. Can you paint the picture of what a neighbourhood battery looks like and where it's going to be installed and how people will experience it?
Yeah, look, it's a very new technology type. There's only I guess maybe 4 or 5
Only a handful,
on the East Coast. And, there's quite a few more in WA. WA have been the leaders in this space. I think there's more like 12 or 13 right over there.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact number. There's a few there.
Yeah, and so look, I'm not so across kind of like exactly how many households they can provide. They can be different sizes. I think that generally we talk about sort of 200 householders, right? Sort of the kind of scale we're talking about. But yeah, you can hop online and do a Google image search of what they look like. But the typical size is something like 3 fridges. Probably put together. And I think, the big question, there are so many questions. We just had a workshop on this very topic just yesterday. And I think pretty much in every discussion group that we had on the various different dimensions of it, there were sort of more questions than answers raised among people working in this space who've been working on it, for the last few years. So there's still a lot of questions around what are the models that are going to work, what are the ways that people are going to engage with this technology, the differences in terms of what types of models are going to work for regional areas versus urban areas. So yeah, I don't know, Claire, if you want to add anything more there, but I think there's just still a lot of questions to be resolved, but a lot of excitement for sure.
Yeah, I was actually just trying to find a way if I could share a picture of the Yarra Energy Foundation battery in North Fitzroy, because they had some really lovely artwork done on it to make it really, visually pleasing. But you're right, it does look like a bunch of very pretty fridges on a street corner. That battery this is one of the benefits of doing this remotely. I can just pull up the info. So the YEF battery in North Fitzroy is 110 kilowatts and 285 kilowatt hours, and services approximately 200 properties. So that's kind of in the order of what we're considering as a neighbourhood battery.
But do you want to, I think, to the second question around sort of installation and design and so on, I mean, that really goes to the skills that we're going to need to do, neighbourhood batteries and most of, the consumer energy resources mix going forward. how does government think about that skills mix, and what are we going to have to do to get those skills over the coming decade?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and one that we've definitely found has been an issue for particularly the smaller community groups as they've gone into these projects, is that there's not a deep appreciation of how complicated it's going to be. And so, this kind of goes back to the network data issue as well, that there's groups just kind of, they approach their DNSP and say, give us the data. And when the DNSP says what data, they're just like, all the data. And then, the process of working through whatever data they do actually define that they need in the end. And, there's lots of different skill sets that go into getting a neighbourhood battery from, we're fired up, we want a neighbourhood battery, through to all of the modelling and all of the business case stuff and how you work through what it will actually pay you versus what you put into it, and all of that stuff over time, and then the commissioning and the installation. And there's been a lot of some projects have had struggles with insurance companies who just don't know how to treat these in terms of insurance products. We're seeing an increasing concern from Fire Rescue Victoria and the CFA about the fire risk of lithium-ion batteries all over the place. So there's a whole bunch of really technical issues that have to be idea to the installation. And I think that I haven't.
It's all right, you're right.
Oh, okay. Yeah, lots of technical work that needs to be done. And I think that sort of extends beyond obviously just neighbourhood batteries to just the changing mix of roles that need to, and skills that we need in order to get this transition implemented. From our perspective, in terms of just back to the neighbourhood battery initiative, it's really becoming a question for us, particularly with a very new government who have committed to 100 neighbourhood batteries, about what is the role of government funding. And lots of the funding has been, and the funding that's being discussed at a federal level is just for the just for the asset, just for the installation. Whereas perhaps there is a need, and again, not remotely signalling any government policy at this point, but there is a question, I guess, about what do we fund? Do we, is it better to help communities to overcome, or groups to overcome some of those other challenges, or is it just the battery on the ground? I literally have no more information than you guys have about the commitment to 100 in Victoria, so I can't sort of comment any further than that, but the skills mix is definitely something that we need to look into.
Great, thanks. I think we've got another question up the back. Yes, please.
Do I need to get the mics on? Thanks. You've spoken a lot about households. I was just wondering if businesses, especially like small businesses or people occupying commercial buildings, have been involved in these projects, and how it looks different for that kind of part of the market compared with households?
No, it's a really great question, and the answer to that is no. We haven't done that research yet, and I think it's a live question for the policymakers at the moment, that if they provide funding for a community battery that's going to a small business in a regional town that provides important jobs for the township, is that a community battery? Can we just justify using taxpayer money for that? I think that is like literally a live question at the moment that's not been answered. And my usual answer to that question is, let's go out and talk to people on what do they think. Does that align with their understanding of the public interest? But yeah, this is such a new space, and there's really not many researchers working in this area. So yeah.
We have typically talked about neighbourhood batteries as being front of the meter, but Hedda's right, it is an active sort of consideration at the moment, but potentially, particularly industrial sites, etc., might be a really good spot for a behind the meter battery that can then provide power to the community. So you end up, you know, in areas that have huge amounts of roof space, and potentially generating quite a lot on weekends, for instance, but not using a lot. You know, could we think about the definition of what we typically think of as a neighbourhood battery to include a lot of other opportunities that will generally help, you know, as Andrew was saying, do all plus. You know, we potentially need to think about neighbourhood batteries as front of the meter and behind the meter and on community buildings, but then selling back to the community, or, you know, whatever it is, to really make sure that we're utilising all of the opportunities.
Yeah, and it would probably be remiss of me not to mention that there is one behind the meter community battery in Yakandanda. So I encourage you to led by Indigo Power, in collaboration with Totally Renewable Yakandanda. So yeah, they've done a bunch of work that's worth looking at. But as far as I know, they're the only sort of community battery that's behind the meter that I know of.
All right, well, I'm just looking at the time and I don't want to get in trouble from Frank if we run too far into the next refreshment break. So we've got one final question and then we'll wrap up from there.
My question is, like, how is Australia placed in the world in adopting this technology, and what lessons can Australia learn from other countries who have advanced in adopting this technology?
Oh, a great final question. This might be a good way to kind of go around the panel. So Andrew, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In many ways, Australia is leading the pack in a lot of the research we're doing around integrating large amounts of distributed energy in particular. So as Lachlan said, we're highest per capita adopter of a lot of this technology. So we, at our group, for example, we've been approached from several other international areas to understand the different techniques that we're using to help the integration of large amounts of this into the system. So techniques such as dynamic operating envelopes, the US, the UK, New Zealand have approached us just to understand more about what's happening there. So in many ways, what we're looking at here and the problems that we're facing are actually informing the international community for specific things. So.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I wish I was more across, the complete global scope of research in this area, because I know that there is a lot of kind of research and interest in sort of microgrid technologies in the Pacific and in South Asia as well, and Africa. I'm not terribly well across that work. I wish I had the time to get my head across a little bit more, but I'm a bit more familiar with the EU context, and there's been a lot of interest in kind of smart local energy systems and a lot of trials. There's a real interest, particularly coming out of the Netherlands, in this idea of niches and these protected spaces where we can sort of trial, we call them sandboxes here, but sort of trial new technologies and new tariffs and new arrangements. And unfortunately, a lot of the early evidence around this coming out of those trials are not particularly optimistic in terms of the kind of local benefits. So they're still often framed very much and led by kind of incumbents. And there's not been a lot of evidence that the values are sort of flowing down to the local community. And we've unfortunately seen similar sorts of things here in Australia with some of the trials where, there's a lot of talk about bringing the values back to people and householders, but when the final designs come out, they often don't sort of live up to that promise. So I would just say we need a lot more research and a lot more capability directed at understanding the kind of the governance and the business models that are actually going to work for people, and the sorts of rules that are going to enable that to work well.
Great. And Claire, can I throw to you?
Sure. Noting that I'm now standing between people and their afternoon tea, I'll keep it brief. But yeah, I think, you look at a jurisdiction like South Australia and the very unique situation that they're in with such high penetration of solar, and, at times it's producing the bulk of their energy supply, and, that requires some protections for the grid that is using some of that innovative technology around flexible exports, and will push further into, some of the technology around interoperability, which is an international, sort of an emerging international standard, but if you look into it, it's not really being taken up anywhere else as yet. So I think Australia is a really interesting testing ground for some of these things. It's now about what we do with it to make sure we bring people and the DER that they're paying for, and we're hoping to sort of help use to help support the transition along with us.
Great, thank you for that. Look, I apologise to the many questions that we didn't get to that have come in on VVox. I hope you found the session interesting and informative. As you can probably tell, we could probably spend many days talking about this topic, and encourage you to follow up with the panelists after the event. Please join me in thanking Claire, Hedda and Andrew, and we'll invite you to refreshments in the foyer.